Well, I'm glad I'm going before the tea break and not after lunch, but it's really a privilege to be part of this course. And as it was mentioned yesterday, you're all an amazing group representing diverse interests, stakeholders, as we say in the public health world. And that's what nutrition is about. It brings together people from different fields who are looking at the issues with different perspectives. Some of you are faced with challenges on the ground where you have to make decisions. Okay, where do we have X amount of resources from a program point of view, whereas others are in the policy or more advocacy area. And so, in this context, I think speaking on maternal child nutrition is easy because that's something people relate, at least to maternal child health. If you look over the generations, sort of as humans, we invest on the continuation of the species. So, as Dr. Menon said yesterday, it's always all about the kid. We forget the mother. So, we've worked hard on bringing the mothers. This doesn't exclude the fathers. This doesn't exclude the families. But there is a strong biological reason, as you see in these pictures, at least for those first 1,000 days, the mother is very central, whether she's carrying the baby in her belly or continuing to nourish the child when they are most vulnerable, either directly through breastfeeding, as other mammals do, but more importantly, that's not the only thing they do, right? They're balancing all their other roles and responsibilities, while the primary responsibility is typically the mother. And I think I would start off with saying there's some excellent work that was done several decades ago from Bangladesh, where they found that the mortality risk for children jumped dramatically when the mother died. So, with respect to all the dads, mothers are critical during these phases. Shweta has given us learning objectives. I hope I can help you accomplish those objectives. And I'm going to be here all day today, so the discussion is always where we learn most. So yesterday, and I think both in the morning and the afternoon, you probably got some strokes of what is the magnitude of the problem. So I won't spend too much time, but just refresh your memory of why maternal and child nutrition is important, why the 1,000 days, which is easier to say than pregnancy and first 2 years of life, some of the causes. But the bulk of my presentation is really to look at what is the evidence base for interventions to improve outcomes, particularly nutrition outcomes. I'm not going to be talking about, there are a whole lot of other outcomes we're interested in, health, development, that many of us also work on, but to keep it within something, I'm focusing on the nutrition one. And in the process of it, as it's already emerged, we have the dual burden that's right here. It's no longer at our doorstep. It's in many people's homes, backyards, whichever way you define. While this is, the undernutrition or the challenges of the first 1,000 days remains what's known, sometimes called an unfinished agenda. So at the level of policymakers and sort of at that higher level, there are constantly, they're viewed as competing challenges, and that's why it's very exciting for me to be, we've been now working for over 10 years with Dr. Prabhakaran, Shweta, et cetera, where there are people who are working with this dual burden and keeping in balance, the various priorities. It's not about the chronic disease people versus the maternal child health people. We're all in this together. So, but how do we optimize? So this is just a recap why the first 1,000 days are so crucial. It is a period of high vulnerability from a nutrition perspective. Per kilogram body weight, the young child in utero and first years of life has a very high requirement. And they have small stomachs, not like us as we grow older, we seem to be able to tuck in more and more. So issues of frequency of feeding, diet density, those issues come up. And then, of course, there is increased susceptibility to infections. So this is where the environment comes in. That a young child is the immune system is still developing. So that same cough, cold, diarrhea affects the young child much more dramatically. Loses nutrients. There's actually breakdown of nutrients. So that kind of you have not enough going in, but a lot being lost as well. So you can see why that nutrient depletion can happen very rapidly. And of course, they're completely dependent on a caregiver, an adult, to be taken care of, essentially, whether it's changing the diaper or feeding the child or playing with the child. So it's broad areas. We've also learned a lot. It's not just what you see in terms of, this child is malnourished, looks small. We talked about size as a proxy. What's really happening when you see a low birth weight child or a stunted child is the stuff you don't see. It's kind of that, it's more than the iceberg. There are very rapid changes happening actually in all organs. The brain particularly, we have learned a lot. It's the first few years of life are crucial. Development continues. A lot of advances have been made, so it's not that you don't continue learning or developing. But I sometimes like to use the analogy, it's kind of like your software, hardware. A lot of the hardware is being laid down early in life, and then if you have lousy hardware, whatever software, it doesn't run, it crashes, right? So that's part of that vulnerability of the early period becomes important. And this is showing you myelination, many of those developmental from a point of what distinguishes us as being higher learning, higher order mammals. I think our cousins are equally smart, but we like to think we're smarter than all the other species. These changes continue on. In addition to the brain, there are also a lot of effects of that happen in the key organs. So this relates to this sort of Barker hypothesis that was proposed, that if you have undernutrition insults starting in utero, there could be damage that's done to some key organs such as the kidney, the liver. So you see where that NCD link happens. It's not that one is doomed because of undernutrition, but it definitely, it's like some of sort of the game of golf, etc. You're walking into life with a handicap, and then when there are changes happening later on, the insults continue beyond early childhood right through as we age. And so, we've done a lot in improving survival, but what about the quality of life? And Dr. Maternal will talk more about it this evening. There's actually a lot of work that's been done. And not that many studies, but a study from Guatemala as an example that many of us have been involved. That it was an intervention of improving nutrition during the first 1,000 days, and we've followed that cohort, many of whom are now my age, and been able to document the returns to improving early childhood nutrition, both short and long term. And there are other cohorts. Dr. Stein has been involved as the New Delhi birth cohort. So we have a body of information to say why we need to invest. That's not being questioned anymore. Now the question is, what do we do it? How do we do it? Where should we do some things? Can we be doing a better job? So that's really where we are. While, as researchers, we still like to look for newer ways, but really we are in an era of what I would say the need of the hour is implementation science. We have some solutions, but how do we scale up? How do we make these things reach the people that it needs to reach? So this is, again, something you saw yesterday. I'm just putting it up there. When we talk about malnutrition, poor outcomes, it's multifactorial. It's not just food, it's the setting, it's caregiving. So you have sort of diet and infection as what we call the immediate causes. So if you want to think very linearly, it's input and infections predisposed losses, but underlying is, the access to food. And when we say insufficient access to food, when this was drafted 25 years ago, it was actually from a project in Tanzania in the 70s, was kind of where this came from originally. People were thinking of food insecurity, traditional rural, agrarian settings where, you have sometimes crop loss, and that's still very relevant in many parts of India. But today, insufficient access to food means different things to different people, and the issue of diet quality has become even more important, and that is something which definitely links sort of the maternal child health agenda and the NCD agenda, that it's not just the quantity, but really we're talking about quality. What are people eating, and is that the best option? And again, that varies depending where you are on the life cycle. And of course, there are the underlying causes. So broadly speaking, there are parts of the world where they've solved this problem without, sort of, I guess, breaking their head about the nitty-gritty. Should I give 100 calories or 300 calories? And we have some examples where, economic growth and pro-public policies were promoted. Brazil is the most well-known example, but we also have other examples, Thailand, and I think, as Dr. Menon said, even within India, we're so diverse. There are examples where these policies have resulted in reductions. And so those really are addressing, then you're getting really into health and development. You're no longer talking about nutrition, you're talking about basic human rights, poverty, education, reproductive health, and clearly disparities come into this, the haves and the have-nots. And there are some very critical interventions outside the health sector. We have conditional cash transfers, water can be debated. The health people would like to take it, but other people would think. So there are these various, as I sort of yesterday mentioned, nutrition belongs to everyone or no one sometimes, but the importance of these other sectors. And access to care, I mean, that is crucial, and especially in the maternal child health sector. Pregnancy is one of the most vulnerable periods, and we know that if you can ensure high quality antenatal care, and India has demonstrated this now, where through the conditional cash transfer of hospital deliveries, now we can get in, there's a whole debate of the quality of care, etc., but it was a felt need. People like that transfer, and that has dramatically reduced infant mortality, maternal mortality, just getting people into the healthcare system. So those are things that are, addressing the underlying. Looking more sort of now, sort of focusing in, I'm going to use this framework, what I mean by the first 1,000 days, and I'm not going to get into evaluation of many of these, what we call WASH interventions. There's a lot of them. I could be speaking all day long. I'm going to sort of get more into the nutrition focus. If you see the first 1,000 days, I think this should work. But anyway, we charted pregnancy, which is, 270 days. Did I just press it over there? Okay, thank you. So, all pregnancies, as I was telling someone, is about 273 days wherever you are in the world. Preterm birth is a challenge, but in general, that's sort of there. And then exclusive breastfeeding is something that's been shown very clearly as protective. Now, it doesn't happen necessarily, but that is something that depends on the mother. So that's why that blue color. So if you're trying to address pregnancy and exclusive breastfeeding, you have to have maternal women-focused interventions. And then as you move into feeding practices, complementary feeding, introduction, because just like too much ghee can be bad for you, because breast milk is good, it's not going to keep you going forever. So this is where we've known this for a long time. Too early introduction or too late introduction of complementary foods, both of those are bad. So there is always balance and optimal, and that's the current recommendation, 6 months. So then, you can continue breastfeeding, but the quality of complementary feeding and diet becomes important. And there, of course, the child is also a player. As a mother of a preterm, low birth weight child, I can attest to that. You may know all the information, but children can be, there's a temperament relation right there, the mother-infant interaction, and then there's the family, and then there is the household, and then there's the mother-in-law, et cetera, et cetera. But so you really get into sort of, you can layer this down to all the other players. Something I've been working more recently, which is not in the 1,000 days, is backtracking a little bit here. As you start seeing the evidence, it's become very convincing. In a way, there's only so much you can do. I mean, it's very important. This is a great opportunity because women come into the healthcare system. It's at least a period when they're getting some attention. But risk factors like maternal height, low BMI, high BMI, which is also a risk factor for pregnancy outcomes, you can't fix them in pregnancy. You have to talk about it earlier. And so then we get into the life cycle. So I'll spend a little time on preconception, and one can say, when does preconception start or end? You can go all the way back till when you were in your mother's womb. So that's that generational. And so the first set of section, I'm going to focus on these maternal women-based interventions. And colleague of mine, Melissa, and myself, we said, okay, we have the UNICEF conceptual framework. How would this look for women's health, women's nutrition? And the purpose of this was really to point out that the various things that we know are important during pregnancy. So if we think of immediate, so here this is preterm, low birth weight, or poor pregnancy outcomes. They are a result of growth restriction or insults that happen in utero. So children can also be born short length for age. They start already shorter. And we've known for many years, weight gain during pregnancy is important. There may be issues with maternal physiology that are still not completely sorted out. Conditions during pregnancy. So this is the part that I said about having adequate care. Eating down is sometimes common in certain settings. Food insecurity, all of these play through during pregnancy. But when you look at it, these things don't suddenly become bad for women. If women are not getting enough to eat when they're pregnant, they already were not eating adequately prior to pregnancy. Do you see what I'm saying? So yes, pregnancy is an opportunity to reach out, to send messages, but many of these conditions exist predate the pregnancy. They occur during adolescence. They occur during, all the way back. So that's something to think as we're talking about messaging and trying to address improving women's health for, the next generation. And about 8 or 9 years ago, Dr. Maternal actually was contacted by the Gates Foundation, which has done a lot, in terms of vaccine preventable diseases, child health. And they said, we really do not know much about what needs to be done in the sort of field of maternal nutrition interventions. I mean, we knew there was a lot of research, but as a, implementing organization, as to provide guidance on the ground. And so basically they reached out, and our group launched a series of papers. So there's been the Lancet paper, which came out that talked about child nutrition interventions. We kind of focused on maternal nutrition interventions to first look at the literature. So some of the slides I'm going to show you are summary of it. These have been updated. This was published in 2012, but the basic message has not changed. Maybe some of the gaps we know a little bit more, but if you're interested, I can share the citation where we literally went and looked at individual interventions. What's the evidence? So this question that was yesterday, are there randomized controlled trials? Are there, well-done observational studies? What is the evidence base? Not from a program that even under controlled conditions can you say what interventions work or don't work. And so we really focused on interventions in pregnancy, but as we went into this, we convinced and we said we would really like to also see what is known about preconception and during the life cycle. And, the outcomes are not exhaustive. There is still, a lot of interest now on looking at child development, et cetera, but we really focused mostly on birth outcomes and some maternal health outcomes. And this is not my quote. It's a very old quote by Frank Hitton, who was one of the sort of fathers of physiology, and some of our understanding of physiological change hasn't changed. But pregnancy, especially I think the first pregnancy, is, I would argue, an insult to the woman's body. I mean, she's suddenly hit, has to ramp it up within a short period. Entire cardiovascular system has to go into full gear. Her blood volume increases over several fold, and delivering the nutrients. So on one side, people talk about, there's inadequate nutrition, undernutrition. There's also a delivery side. Even well-nourished women, I was well-nourished, tall, and I had severe preeclampsia. So there are biological systems also, that it's not just the consumption, but the delivery of nutrients. Why do short women have smaller children? We were just discussing yesterday. It doesn't sound very nice, but there are studies to say what's known as the container effect. There's only so much a baby can grow when you're a small person. And so, we had this discussion of genetics versus, if you're small because you didn't grow well, it gets encoded in. So anyway, it is a period of significant physiological change, and there's been work over the years. There's a variety of adverse outcomes that can result, that are related to nutrition. Now, there are a lot of other areas of infections, etc. I'm not getting into them, but this just sort of shows the plethora of possible adverse outcomes that can be related when nutrient requirements are not met during gestation. And we focused on some key ones for this meta-analysis. And the quality of the evidence varied for some nutrients like zinc and iron. Many studies were done. We didn't restrict it to studies only in the LMIC, or we just said what's been done, where are the studies, and when there were enough randomized controlled trials, we did meta-analysis, which Dr. Stein will talk about. But basically, so as I said, there's variable evidence. Some are 2-3 studies, some are there's more data. But based on the literature, we were able to see that providing balanced protein energy supplements did significantly reduce the risk of stillbirths and neonatal mortality, with the caveat that most of these studies were done in settings where food insecurity was common. We're not talking about overweight women, etc. So there's been a lot of question now, should we have targeted supplementary feeding? And actually, there's not a whole lot that within, but you need to, again, then go back to the studies and see where they were done. But most of these they were done in there's a very large study in the Gambia where there's a lot of seasonal variation in food availability, some in India. And then the topic that's been studied a lot, and that I also have worked in my research, was providing multiple micronutrients, again coming from the perspective that when diets are inadequate, they're not inadequate just in a single nutrient. It's probably several nutrients, and so food supplements are good, but they're expensive, they're not easy to distribute. And in an era as we are moving towards where diet quality is an issue, we don't want to necessarily give people a whole lot of calories. That's kind of what drove. So the multiple micronutrients, actually several trials have been done, and there was a reduction in stillbirths. And that's important because some of the earlier studies, there was a suggestion that there may be increased risk of mortality. So this is still not sort of stamped as a recommendation, but we clearly showed that there was any increased adverse effect as people were concerned about when some of the initial studies were done. And when we look at low birth weight and preterm, We also see some evidence of benefit. Vitamin D, there were just a few studies, so there's now a few more studies that have come out, and then multiple micronutrients again showed benefits, and the balanced protein energy malnutrition. And one of the challenges when you look at these kind of, you're putting all the studies together and you're trying to compare apples to oranges to pears to pineapples, I always say we need to exercise caution. What are we comparing to? So for example, in the multiple micronutrient trials, the referent group was always IFA, because these were done much later. It was unethical to not give IFA. Whereas some of the IFA studies were really older ones, because they could be done only when they were done in the 70s, 80s, when it was not standard of practice. So those are some things to think, what is the background against which these are done? And in many ways, that's reality. People say context determines your response to intervention. You can't control it always, but just keep that in mind. So in other words, one might argue that the benefit that we're giving here to multiple micronutrients is actually an underestimate of the benefit if you compare it to doing nothing. Now, we're not saying people should do nothing, but what are you comparing? And so in the studies, ethically, we compared it systematically to current standard of practice, not giving a placebo which didn't have anything. So that's just something I wanted to point out. And this is sort of the key findings based on the quality of the studies, the size, how well these studies were done. And you can see that we have, pretty good evidence for supporting balanced protein energy supplements and IFA and multiple micronutrients. With preterm birth, it's much lower. There is some suggestion that preterm N3, the fatty acids, can reduce severe preterm birth. We found that also in one of our reviews, and actually zinc also was found to be beneficial. So that's just something to keep in mind. And essentially the conclusions, because this was our sort of what Gates said, is tell us what works, what do we not know, and what needs more scaling up. And we basically said things we've been doing, but we need to do better. There is evidence that if you do it well, we can address some of these issues. And those are the IFA, balanced protein energy, and iodine, of course, which is coming through iodized salt in most places. I think the new, not entirely new, but at least from the evidence base, it was clear evidence that calcium is also beneficial, and then the multiple micronutrients. But these are not necessarily mainstreamed or in programs, and there are different sets of challenges. Calcium supplements are much bigger. How do we deliver? So since we did this, there have been studies in finding out how can we do a better job of delivering calcium. So perhaps, there isn't anything wrong with the old advice of take 2 glasses of milk. We can get into debate whether it's 1%, 2%, or 4%. But having, they're coming from a diet quality, and similarly, multiple micronutrients still has not been elevated to the policy. I think it's definitely something that's more implementable. You're switching the tablet, but people have also, there has been some resistance. And so I asked Shweta, should I keep this? And she said, go ahead. I pulled up what are the latest Wto recommendations. And you can see this is more as a reference. They do talk about for balanced protein energy malnutrition. They recommend it in undernourished populations. And when I say balanced, the idea is high protein has been shown actually as not being good. So this is the amount of calories that come from protein is comparable to any sort of regular food. It's not pumped with protein. And then IFA is still very much there. Calcium is there, especially in settings where you have low calcium and intakes. And then, vitamin A is only when you have a lot of vitamin A deficiency. It doesn't do much for low birth weight, preterm, but we do know it can be related to anemia in many settings if there's a lot of vitamin A deficiency. And I kind of highlighted here, we have an example where I personally think there's a disconnect. WHO still doesn't want to commit to multiple micronutrients when the evidence is pretty strong and out there. So research evidence does not always translate. A policy is sausage making and politics and different players come into it. And in fact, fairly recently, another meta-analysis was done where they pooled all the various studies and again confirmed what we had said, that multiple micronutrients do reduce the risk of low birth weight, and even they even showed some protective effects on preterm. And so we'll see where that story continues, and no increased risk of adverse. There was the reason the multiple micronutrient kind of got stalled, as people said, well, it might increase mortality, but these more recent meta-analysis confirm again what we published 5 years ago. So moving back to sort of my conceptual framework, I guess, I've given you a little bit of a summary of what can be done during pregnancy. I want to spend a little bit time about why preconception is important. Because during pregnancy, you can provide certain nutrition interventions, but there are underlying factors. And there are two reasons why preconception is important. At a biological level, it is a very critical period when women do not know they're pregnant. So we say preconception, periconception, but we're really talking about right at and around the time of conception. Most people don't know, most women don't know they're pregnant. They find out they're pregnant if they're 6 weeks, but maybe in many places 12 weeks until they get into care. And a lot of things have happened by the first 12, in that first trimester. There's embryogenesis, the placentation, the implantation. That's when pregnancy losses happen. And there's quite a bit of basic science evidence from animal studies, observational studies, indicating that the milieu, in other words, the nutrient availability, the setting, stress, some people have done, people in environmental health have looked at toxins, is very critical for that. Again, that's hardware. By the time the fetus is 6-7 weeks, it's fully formed. I mean, it has a heartbeat, it's got everything, and then basically from second and third trimester, it's really grow. That's what's happening. So when we think about intrauterine life, low birth weight, yes, we use size as a proxy, but if there are some of these things that may go wrong very early, and there's evidence from the Dutch famine study that Ari's been involved, where they were able to look acute malnutrition during these critical phases had differential effects. So this is not entirely new, but definitely something, as you think in policy, where people say, oh, we've done all this maternal nutrition interventions, nothing's shifting, because we've had a hard time shifting the rates of low birth weight, especially in the South Asian regions. And the other way of looking at preconception is just in a very simpler version of the intergenerational nature of growth failure. You are born as a low birth weight baby. There's a lot of evidence to say that low birth weight babies are at increased risk of growth failure later on. They're born small. They're more likely to fall sick. They're more likely to experience subsequent growth restriction. And essentially, if that's a girl, she ends up being a small, probably light adult woman. And then if you happen to be a girl who's born in Bihar, you get pregnant even before you can finish growing, because we do grow. It's not just the 1,000 days. We do grow at adolescence. There's a growth spurt. But if you are married off when you're 15 and get your first child by the time of 16, that opportunity to grow a little bit more, even if it's an inch or two, is lost. And so you get into the cycle, which is, cultural, but also biological, that the next low birth weight. So somebody asked, do we have to wait 30 years? Yes, but that doesn't mean there are things we can do at various time points. And so that's something to keep in mind. So that really brings to that sort of that preconception. How can we get women into pregnancy in the best of health? And this, I think, is actually receiving more attention in the current era of dual burden, because you can be short and underweight, or you can be short and overweight, depending where you're living, and increased risk of Gestational diabetes, people think is something bad that happens during pregnancy, but increasingly we know women are coming if they're overweight or they're metabolically, they don't have to be necessarily overweight, but if they're metabolically unhealthy, they are already predisposed to carbohydrate regulation, and that puts them at risk of delivering having unhealthy pregnancy outcomes. And so when we looked at what do we know at that time, the area that was well studied is folic acid supplementation, showing its relationship to neural tube defects. The burden of neural tube defects is this much compared to the burden of low birth weight or stunting. But clearly, has anyone here seen a child with, who may have, or seen pictures of a child with neural tube defects? Yeah. So it's pretty dramatic. I mean, it may not be a large, but these children basically, the spinal cord doesn't connect, so in many settings they die or they are disabled for life. Most often they don't live very long. So it's very traumatic. And so that definitely in the public health world, showing that an intervention with folic acid could reduce it has taken a lot of traction. So folic acid fortification is mandatory in the US. I know in India it's been a little bit more controversial because, as again, one intervention may have other effects. With B12, Dr. Yagnik will talk more about it tomorrow. But we also found a lot of observational studies indicating the relationship between maternal underweight and risk of low birth weight IUGR. Similarly with overweight women, and a few studies which had collected data on anemia before pregnancy and then linking it to increased risk. And so that's important because iron requirements increase dramatically during pregnancy and women get anemic. But in settings, especially like in India, women are going into pregnancy being highly anemic. I mean, the prevalence of anemia in women of reproductive age is only about 10 percentage points lower than during pregnancy. So you're already, going in, and there's been suggestions of linking with these risks. And so this is some meta-analysis which show clearly the increased risk of preterm birth with underweight, because for a long time people thought it was only low birth weight, but this is actually showing also for preterm. And then we have very high quality prospective data that we collected in a study in Vietnam, because most of the observational studies tend to be what's in the record, or people have recalled, this is what I think I weighed. So that's been one of the issues. And we looked at a bunch of indicators in this cohort where we measured women before they got pregnant and then followed them up. And we found low weight was the most important. Simple screening tool of risk, which can be done before women get pregnant. But when we started looking at trials, at the time we did it, there were none. But since then, there have been studies, and I'm not going to describe all of them, but happy to share references. One of them was done right here in India by by Caroline Fall, who's based in the UK, and collaborators in Pune and Mumbai, where they basically came with a food-based approach. This was done in rural, urban slums in Bombay, where they gave a micronutrient energy-dense sack. So basically, they gave them a white samosa and a green samosa. They were still samosas, but these were given with more green leafy vegetables. And remember, it's pregnancy, so they were okay. They needed a little bit extra calories, but they said, let's give a healthier calories. And it was not an easy study. I mean, can you imagine doing something, and they had the floods, etc. But I'll share some results. Around the same time, our team, in collaboration with one of our alums and who works closely actually at IFPRI, Dr. Feng Nguyen, we did a trial in Vietnam where we said, we're giving IFA during pregnancy. WHO was already saying, let's give weekly IFA to women of reproductive age. India has the adolescent health program. But when we looked, we found very little evidence. Does this necessarily translate to improved birth outcomes? So we didn't aim for the food-based approach, but chose the easier one of giving a pill. And we were able to do a placebo-controlled trial where we gave weekly supplements before women conceived of just IFA, just folic acid, because again, there was no folic acid supplementation, and we knew that it would be unethical to deny women folic acid. And then the third arm got multiple micronutrients. And we didn't have any formulation, so basically we took the pregnancy pill and upped the vitamin D because there was a lot of, already people are saying vitamin D should be a little higher. But they got it only once a week, so it's not a whole lot. We gave it to them once a week, and when they got pregnant, they switched to IFA, which is standard of care, and followed them up. And then most recently, this was a very large NIH-funded grant that basically used that peanut butter that you are all fighting about, the lipid-based micronutrient supplements. So this was given to women, and they did it in 4 settings in India, actually near Belgaum, where Shweta has worked, Pakistan, Guatemala, and Democratic Republic. So it was a multi-center trial, different settings. And it was a little complicated design. I'm not going to get into all of it, but basically, women were, if they were low BMI, then they got extra calories. Otherwise, they got just a lower dose, and they started preconception and early, and then some didn't get preconception. They just got it during pregnancy, so they kind of staggered. So it's a little complicated, but they have some interesting results, which vary by the site. I'm going to show you what matters here. I know in India we always want to see Indian results. So this is from our colleagues in Bombay. And basically, they didn't find a big difference in birth weight. You can see it's about 26 grams. The treatment did better. This is in birth weight. But what they did find is that women who had a higher BMI, these are not overweight women, fat women, they're just higher BMI, because these are all, as you can see, the mean, a third of them were at 18.5. So they had some really skinny women, some women just about there, and then some who were what probably most people would say a little healthier. They didn't have any overweight women. And they found a larger difference in those who were quote unquote healthier. So in other words, is there a limiting factor that, when you're so underweight, you can't just benefit from a few extra micronutrients preconceptionally? And these are all, in this study, they continued getting the intervention during pregnancy, so don't do it, but, they were able to look at women who started earlier. And this slide is the same study, but where they really looked at women who consume, because we can't, when we do these trials, we can't tell women when to get pregnant. We at least try to recruit ones who plan to get pregnant. So those are all the challenges why these studies were not done. But you have the data, and so then they said, let's look at the subsample of women who took the intervention for at least 12 weeks. Eating a green samosa for a week is not going to shift you dramatically, but they took it at least for 12 weeks. And then you see, it's plausible results. You see an amplification. The overall one is slightly higher. It's 48 grams. But when you go to the about the third group of BMI, 113 grams is shifting the distribution. So anyway, not dramatic, but still think about it. This is an intervention that's starting before conception and has some benefits shown to it. In our study in Vietnam, since I happen to be I have to mention it at least, we didn't give energy, and actually the prevalence of low birth weight is only 5% in Vietnam. They had excellent health care. We did not see differences in mean birth weight overall, but again, when we broke it down to women who took it at least for 6 months, because remember, our people are taking a tablet once a week, so we said at least 6 months worth, it's like, 4 times 6, 24 tablets. There we saw a larger difference, so that's some consistency, there was differences. But what's interesting is we followed this cohort up, and even though they were not very different at birth, their growth trajectories are slightly different in that the kids who received multiple micronutrients or IFA, they all have growth restriction. They all, start falling off the pattern you saw, but they seem to fall off a little. So is that programming? I mean, we're still following up. We're also seeing some differences in motor development, small, but we're in the process of following these children up. So some more evidence. But bigger picture, these are, we're tweaking, we're giving nutrient interventions. We have fairly good evidence, which is observational. You can't do trials like this, but that women who are younger are have worse outcomes. And some studies where, they've been able to, if you have delaying age at marriage, first birth, there is, improved outcomes. So I think there are things we can do. We do not have to wait for more trials and food supplementation. That need to be, depending on, so when you do your exercise, this will make sense. If you're in an area where age at first birth is 16, you don't have to wait for any nutrition trials. You have to get out there and find what it takes, what's the social context, why, how can you help girls just wait another year? That even it'll make a difference to their birth outcomes. And so that's why I want to emphasize the importance of reproductive factors. We have to work with people in reproductive health. We have to work in people in those sectors. So Shweta is like giving me the hand. So now I'll start moving faster. You've seen these, again, that, pregnancy is important, but a lot of growth restriction, both anemia and stunting increase rapidly in the first few years of life. Someone asked this yesterday, so I put it up. The CNNS survey, you'll hear more. Actually, for the first time, we have a lot of data on biomarkers. So you can see iron deficiency, because for a long time people said, oh, anemia, but it's not iron deficiency. About a third of the kids have iron deficiency, followed by folic acid, zinc, B12. And then feeding practices have improved, but they're still suboptimal. These are what we want all kids to be doing, and you can see we have work to do, and this may vary depending where you are. Even within this is just national data, and it's just showing this in a slightly different way what happens. So, and then finally, diet quality. So even if you say, okay, breastfeeding we've taken care of, children are eating, but what are they eating? The diet quality is pretty abysmal, and again varies. Some states like, Orissa is a poor state, but still is doing better than some other states. So there's different ways. So I'm going to talk about what can be done. And we have several nutrition-specific interventions. When I say nutrition-specific interventions, there's different definitions. I'm talking about popping nutrients into kids' mouths, okay? As close as it gets. So we have zinc supplementation, vitamin A, iron, and there's a lot of evidence that if this is given appropriately, there are benefits. There's no question about it. The question is, how do you deliver this? And I'll talk a little bit about the multiple micronutrient powders. The nutrition, this is actually nutrition specific. Some people may say nutrition education is nutrition sensitive, so that's a typo there. But it's not about just going around distributing nutrients. We really want sustainable approaches. We want to help families feed their children better. How can they use what's within the environment? So then we get into behavior change communication. It used to be nutrition education years ago, but education is, here, do this, right? But how are people going to do it? Why they can't do it? So that's kind of where the behavior change communication strategies really take into account what is the setting, what are the constraints. And then there are larger, we are in a public nutrition policy, the whole food system. We're talking about, people, yes, individuals make choices, but the choices are constrained by what's around them. So there's a lot of interest in that. And then there are they're not nutrition, but they have an effect on nutrition outcomes, whether we're talking about water and sanitation. Deworming is a really important intervention for anemia, because when you have a lot of hookworm infestation, you lose iron. So those, and then cash transfer programs are right on top, where people know what to do if you give them the cash or you tell them what they should do. So in terms of strategies for infant young child feeding, which I'm going to sort of focus on, there are many others. Breastfeeding is something, fortunately it's traditional in our culture, people do it, but still we are in a changing environment and it's easier said than done. Anyone who's tried it. And there are various structural, familial and individual issues that affect, women are not denying their children. If they're not breastfeeding, there are various factors that are playing into it. Either they've got to go to work, whether it's in the field or whether it is in a factory, etc. And so there's a lot of interventions, a lot of work's been done in this area. And there's a lot of evidence of benefit. Again, the question is the how. These are not inexpensive. Somebody here, a couple of people who are interested in costs. So some of these are very intensive interventions. But the benefits of breastfeeding are also quite large. So again, you're always, you need to do cost benefit, cost effectiveness, right? But this is just giving you a little bit of the various interventions that have been successful. And I think some key takeaway points I want you to have is you don't wait till the baby is born. There is increasing body of evidence saying antenatal counseling will help with improving breastfeeding. Similarly, addressing fathers, targeting communities. So it's not just talking to the mom, and mass media also has a lot of potential. And then this is globally, but I think it's very relevant also for India as women are more in the workforce. There's always been that tension of, yes, you tell the mother she has to breastfeed, but she also has to go to work. If she doesn't have a supportive environment, how is she going to do that? So there is really room for policies and enabling interventions. With complementary feeding, we have real issues. The key ones are the quality of the diet. It's also the frequency of feeding, and it relates to time availability. I think Dr. Menon talked about some of these. And I just wanted to share a couple of slides that she shared with me, because her group, the IFPRI group, has really done some excellent work demonstrating rigorously that you can get large, substantial impacts on nutrition-related behavior in varying contexts. Because for a lot of time, nutrition education is not new. We've been doing this since 1975. We say, oh, people don't listen. It's not worth it. We can't, behavior is difficult to change. So they really took this challenge and used a very complex framework. This is the Alive and Thrive program, where you see the mothers and the caregivers at the center, but you go all the way to the policymakers, right? So there's these layers. And they focused right on the feeding practices. They did look at stunting, et cetera, but they were really looking at what is it going to take to address these limiting these behaviors. How can we improve the quality of complementary feeding? How can we improve breastfeeding rates, etc.? They did it in 3 countries, in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Vietnam. They had an intensive and a non-intensive, and were able to show, it was all behavior change, very, very, the Gates Foundation funded this. They spent a lot of money, but this was kind of, the Cadillac version. Under best of circumstances, can we do this? But it was still done at scale. It was not a small numbers. It was large sets of population. And they were able to show in these varying settings, the extremely different settings, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Vietnam, they could, move the exclusive breastfeeding rates. They were able to improve. The blue line below is just Ethiopia. And then, they're all at different levels, but they were able to demonstrate improvements in complementary feeding practices. And I think what's something everyone is always concerned is, okay, once you pull out these inputs, do people go back to doing, business as usual? And yes, some of the rates dropped, but they still, for the intensive one, they were able to sustain some benefits. So those are always important things as you think of large programs about, when you go away, do people, are these changes maintainable? And so I'm just showing you, this is, I found this is a very neat one, the one in Bangladesh, where they use sort of on-the-ground counseling right there, but they backed it up with mass media. I mean, I'm going to take a few extra minutes, but I was just in the field in Tamil Nadu, where we're doing indoor air pollution. We're looking at cook stoves, and really poor part, Tamil Nadu is good, but there are parts where things are bad. They have high anemia, high low birth weight. So I was in the field. And I go there, the pregnant girl, she's a girl, she's really underweight, etc. But what do I see? I didn't take a picture. There's these 2 kids sitting on a smartphone watching a movie. So media, the WhatsApp and phones and TVs are everywhere. They've penetrated. So how can we be smart and use some of these platforms to disseminate messages? And so this is showing in Bangladesh, where they showed sort of the mutually reinforcing impact of mass media interventions along with the individual counseling. And this is just data from India. It's a little older. I think it's probably gone up about the reach of at least TV. I think this is older data. If we get updated ones, it would go up. So finally, I'm going to sort of wrap up with some of the micronutrient interventions. And I bring this up because, yes, we do behavior change. We tell people they should breastfeed. All of these are on the individual. But if you're really in settings where diets are poor quality, a lot of issues about the quality of the food supply itself, and there would be settings where you may need to provide the micronutrients. And again, even when we do fortification, children eat such small amounts that the amount you put in fortification can't be calibrated to what children consume versus adults. There's all those challenges. And so there has been a lot of movement in, how can we provide several micronutrients, and that's kind of where the multiple micronutrient powders that have been shown in trials to be effective. And this is basically home-based fortification. So if you can sell Maggie with a little thing of that junk that comes into it, why not give them good junk? Excuse my language. But you give them micronutrients, teach people, they mix it so that they can improve the quality of that low energy, low nutrient density food quickly. And these are some of the advantages. But again, there is the questions of how do people still think of it, is it a medical approach or is it a sustainable approach? What's the cost? And so this is, there's very good evidence base showing that multiple micronutrients, even if they get it 2 to 3 times a week for 6 to 8 months, you can reduce anemia, you can reduce iron deficiency. And so we had the opportunity. It was not easy. It took a long time. We were working with CARE in Bihar to say, let's do this at scale. Will this work? Will people consume it? And so we used the existing health system. It was through the ICDS. So it really was implementation science. And some of the key things, as I think you'll hear more of this later in this session, later in this in the week, you have the supplement, which is seen as this foreign product. We had to take it. We did formative work. How do you adapt it? How do you make it locally relevant? And so it was, we really took some marketing approaches. How do you socially market it? And that people would identify. We had a lot of formative work. We actually fed it to the village health leaders, to the mothers, and that was really important in developing the messages. And it was fairly successful. It was not without challenges, but we were able to reduce anemia in this setting. But I had to put this because this has come up more than one time. The multiple micronutrient approach is very different from what has been brought up as the LNS, which is really something that was formulated as a therapeutic approach for children who are severely malnourished, who are at risk. And sometimes when you see similar things, this has been a real challenge and is confusing everybody. My understanding of the literature is these, as the word says, is ready-to-use therapeutic foods have been very effective in dealing with children who are really malnourished, off the charts, etc. But the studies that have just given it at a population level have mixed findings. They actually did this even with pregnant women. The benefits have been mixed. So it's still an area that's receiving attention and and I think we do need to be cautious. Basically, it's that multiple micronutrients with the peanut butter and all the stuff. So I think we need to go with caution and see how we need to target it. So this is my final slide. This was from 2013. So a lot of the things I've talked about are not new. They've been around. This is the sort of research, evidence-based programs that's happened over the last 40, 50 years. And this conceptual framework is really important. As we even say, first 1,000 days, that's an opportunity, that's a key period, but there are things we may want to do at adolescence, before in pre-pregnancy, and then of course you go neonates. And I think where we are today is we know we have a menu of things that we could be doing. The issue is adapting it to what's needed in your setting, making sure the coverage is there. So this is showing, again, in some people wanted cost things. If it's done well, these are, they're not cheap, but they're cost effective. These are done in terms of life saved. But if we take this and want to translate it into productivity, etc., that work has not been done. But I think in India where we are is really more in making sure the interventions are reaching the most. And Dr. Menon has shared some slides, but I'm not going to pull them up, but maybe when we do the group work, we have, that's the big push that's happening right now. It's not about coming up with another 10 interventions, but we know what these are, these interventions. IFA supplementation during pregnancy has been done here since the 60s. ICDS gives balanced protein energy supplements in the books, gives balanced protein energy supplements to women, pregnant women. Do the pregnant women come? Do the one who need it most receive it? And where we have high things is access, antenatal care. So calcium is something which has been discussed and not on the thing. So anyway, many of these things have been, where I guess before all the evidence base came, there were people who kind of knew these were the right things to do, but we still have to do them well. Thank you.
Thank you, Usha. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. I just have one comment as well as question to make. In India, we do have, program, a nutrition program, which is called Poshan Abhiyan, which is implementing. And then more or less, if you look at the intervention under Poshan Abhiyan itself, is hardly concentrated on 1,000 days. Nobody are talking about preconception period. Even in health system also, this policy lacks. The health system treats them as eligible couples only for the family planning, service provision. But nobody talks about, iron folic acid supplementation, and then the concept of getting ready for pregnancy in India lacks. In a very high class, I shouldn't say high class. Most of the educated one usually think that they should consult a doctor before getting pregnancy. But in community, it doesn't happen like that. When they get married, immediately get pregnant, then only they approach the health system.
Right.
So how do we, bridge this gap? There is lack of policies. One you wonderfully discussed about Vietnam studies. So are there any studies which are done in Indian specific these things? See, for instance, tomorrow if I go back to my workplace, Assam, if I want to design a specific policy only for that preconception period, which is very crucial and very important, which I learned from your slide. So what it would be? So are there any behavioral change models or otherwise any stronger evidences? Not just iron folic acid, tablets which is recommended by WHO.
Well,
we do have.
So we are ready to do this in a program context. I don't think we need more. Quite honestly, I wanted to do my Vietnam study in India, but I said I would be old by the time I would get it all cleared. So that's true. We had a very good collaborator. We said, let's do this, let's show it. The Vietnamese women are are not a
You're audible.
Whole lot different, but I learned a lot working in Vietnam because they have a fantastic healthcare system. They don't even distribute IFA. They actually, when they said, we tell women they need to take it, and they take it. So anyway, they have a lot of behavior change. But to answer your question, the adolescent program, Sabla, is the platform that's already there. It's on the adolescent framework. And that doesn't mean we're telling adolescents to get pregnant, but this is just that little gap there. And you're absolutely right. I think we have now MN, RCH, all the alphabet soup. So working with RCH is going to be really important. And we have baggage with the family planning program, which had a very negative image. But if that can, I think the country is ready to sort of move away and say this is about optimizing people having healthy families, and we don't need, we can talk to, I think we're ready to do this and happy to follow up. Yeah.
If I can just add a couple more things there from some work that we've done looking observationally, right? So kind of, as Usha pointed out, right, there's a lot of adverse consequences of being born to a very young mother, right? So the policy lever has to be not necessarily kind of, thinking about when between marriage and conception, right? Because kind of the reason people get married is to have children, right? But it has to be to delay the marriage. That's the policy lever that we have, politically, socially, right? And how do you do that, right? You do that by keeping the girls in school. Because a girl in school isn't, getting married, and she's not getting pregnant, right? So the policy levers around keeping the girls in school is the action point here. Now, just as an aside, Usha and I have a very good friend, colleague at our university, whose wedding present to every student he's ever had is 2 years' supply of folic acid, right? That she takes starting the day of the wedding, right? And this is in America, right? Because, even with folic acid fortification of our grains, right, we still have a certain proportion of people who are not adequately statused. But that's his present. He's been spending his whole career working on neural 2 defects. So he believes passionately in folic acid. And he gives 2 years' supply as a wedding present. Just start taking it. You don't know when you're going to get pregnant. Maybe next week, maybe a year. But if you start taking folic acid, you'll be ready. But the policy lever has to be keeping the girls in school.
Yeah, and I just want to add, we have a legal age of marriage. It's not that India doesn't have the law is you can't get married by 18, but we know what's happening on the ground. So it's going to have to happen at various levels. Media messaging, I think we just need to, you have to do it at all levels, and it turns around, hopefully. That's what you're seeing. I know in Tamil Nadu, mean age, there are these few pockets, but on average, it's 21, and it's because I don't have the evidence. I think if Pri is trying to create that story, but it was the school program, it was the lunch program, it was the midday meal program, which everyone said, oh, it didn't do anything for stunting, but it kept girls in school, and it moved, it took 30 years, but anyway, so there are different approaches. Yep.
Hi, Usha. It was a very nice presentation. My question is on compliance of these kind of interventions, especially the micronutrient premixes that you give to these kids and moms.
Right.
What's the compliance level like? How are they accommodating? Do they use it, or it's like taken and thrown away and not consumed?
Right. So we had to work hard. That's where the behavior change communication you can't undercut it or underestimate the effort that goes in. And often, as those of us trained in nutrition, that's not our area of expertise. We don't learn how to change behavior. I keep telling my own family that, I'm not a behavior change expert. I can tell you what you should eat, but I can't make you eat the right thing. So there was a lot of effort, and but if it's done well, and if it's not just the behavior change of that mother there, it's it's the entire community, the mobilization, the healthcare. If the Anganwadi worker doesn't care about it, forget about it. It's never going to happen. If the A&M says, yeah, throw it out. So there is a lot of, it took a lot of effort, but with the right messaging, with the right investments, with the having the community engagement, it's doable. But that's something where I think we have people like our colleagues at IFPRI, where they've done it at scale, and we don't need to relearn it, but that's needed, absolutely.
Thank you.
But they did it, and it didn't happen overnight. We had to work hard at it.